how did you find the training on the Lancaster and Dakota?
It's a big boys' school. It's one of those things where there are not the hours to be afforded to training. In fact, for me, it was a very steep learning curve, because when I joined BBMF, the first thing you've got to learn is get your head around the concept of a tail dragger. And a tail dragger, and there are lots of people who understand what I'm talking about, is a very different aeroplane to a normal aircraft with conventional tricycle undercarriage with a nose wheel and 2 main wheels, or more main wheels behind it. The physics of the tail dragger, if you let them out the box, they can get you into a whole world of hurt extremely quickly. Now, I wasn't necessarily familiar with that, but when I joined the flight, I started off in the left seat of the Dakota and did some displays in that and all the rest of it. And you sit there when it's bouncing down the runway thinking, why is it doing this? And you then go and read books and talk to other people who've flown the aircraft, veterans, or you ring Air Atlantique, as was the case at the time, talk to their pilots about, why is this happening and what's going on? And they give you some useful advice, and you assimilate all this. And then I moved to the right seat of the Lancaster. After you had some time on the Dakota in the left-hand seat, you start training in the right seat of the Lancaster. And very quickly, having done my right seat training that very season, I was then moved to the left seat of the Lancaster. Now it was kind of trepidation, really, because I'm one of these guys who, as I've said to you before, I've always worked hard to try to understand what makes an aircraft tick. And I hadn't quite got my head around the concepts of what made these ones tick yet. Bearing in mind, many men had gone before me who've flown these aircraft with far fewer hours than I had, and these were taking all the capacity I could muster to try and keep them under control at times. Because the only safety brake in those aircraft is you. As the pilot and the crew. You don't have any modern systems to keep you out of trouble. You are the safety brake. If the engine overheats, you shut it down. It doesn't do it itself. So, it was a very steep learning curve, and particularly on the handling side, and getting my head around what happened on the tail dragging side. And I remember I was in the left-hand seat of the Lancaster of my first go in it, and it was Farnborough, which is no pressure, Farnborough Air Show, and we had to go down to Benson to deploy down there. And we were going to be doing a pre-assessment. The way Farnborough worked in those days, I think it's still much the same way as it was you had to be viewed by the Farnborough Flying Control Committee to ensure that your display was adequate and safe enough for them to present to the public at their air show. So we had to take off from Benson to go across to Farnborough to do a rehearsal and then come back and say, yes, that's okay, even though it was BBMF and it's the same display as they routinely do. But when I arrived at Benson on the way down that day, they changed the runway on us, and I was now landing on the short runway with a great big heavy bomber, which to say I was comfortable with it wasn't quite the word I would use. I'd got my head around the concepts of flying it. But we came in, as I'm on the approach to the short runway, with quite a stiff old crosswind, and I was limited to 10 knots across at this stage, and it was 10 knots across. I noticed, I said, what's that in front of me? Hey, it's a tree, and of course you heave the bomber up. And now you've noticed the runway, when there are things you are told to hang your hack on when you're a pilot. The runway disappearing under the nose is not a good thing. It's one of the 3 most useless things to a pilot is runway behind you. And so I brought the aircraft back down again towards the runway and started with quite a rate of descent. And as I came into what I assessed to be the flare, the nav was we used to shout the height out from looking out of the side, looking at the height of the main wheel above the runway, below in this case, the number 3 engine. The number 2 engine as we came into the 5 bang, and of course you hit the ground, and of course they bounce, and this is you learn about tail draggers from this. It bounced and it bounced again, and I eventually got it under control, but I came away thinking, I'm not sure if this is and so I went away and I did a lot of reading about it, and I did what I have always done in the past, got my head in some books, got some books about the science of flight and all the rest of it, and I made it, as I said at the past, where I've gone through training and I've been unsure about certain aspects of the academic side. I've made it my mission to go and get my head around the more difficult side of it, to try to understand what's going on. So I then got my head around the physics of tail draggers, how they all worked, and I never looked back, and it was the greatest thing I could have done. I also spoke to veterans on what they'd done, and listening to veterans, they were hilarious. What did you do in this situation? I just hang on, son, that's all I did. And right, okay, yeah, I went bouncing down the runway too. And of course, you think about it, and they were right, the wartime vets they're what the aircraft were about. Fantastic men, and they too had so little training, and they learned through bitter experience. And if they got the aircraft back, that was one thing. So it was, little things like that. But it all came together. I mean, again, the Lancaster was one of those aircraft that you'd be, and the Dakota the same, you'd be reasonably comfortable with it, but it could still bite you on the backside in certain conditions. And it was chaos theory. What you'll do on one runway in one set of environmental conditions that work perfectly will not work perfectly in the same set of environmental conditions on a similar runway, for whatever reason.
So could you tell us about the training on the Jag and what it entailed?
There was a lot. It was different in so many ways. You were being introduced to some new concepts. At that time, the aircraft was very much the cutting edge of a ground attack aircraft. And it was described, I remember an article in the Times about it being described as the all-singing, all-dancing new ground attack aircraft that had entered service with this navigation equipment system based with an inertial platform. It had a head-up display, which was a relatively new concept in aviation at the time. And it had a projected map display. And these were the things that you're going to be introduced to. So when the training started, as I recall, there were many phases of training. There were about 10, I believe, when you started the OCU. Initially, you start with the ground school, just as you do with any other phase of training. When you go through academics, you learn about the systems, how they work, how they interact with the flight reference cards, any malfunctions, how to deal with them, emergency procedures and the like. You then get on to the basic conversion training, which is training you as a pilot to learn the differences between what has gone in the past and what now comes in the future. So you learn about the differences, and you very quickly pick up on about the fact that the aircraft has a head-up display. So it's learning how to utilise that as an information presentation. You learn about the salient differences between it and the aircraft that went before. And the Jaguar has some quite interesting handling characteristics which you're briefed about during the conversion phase as well. I'll come on to that later. You then move on to the instrument phase, which is learning how to fly the aircraft on instruments. As I said, primarily that's done using the head-up display, which is a new thing for me at the time. You still cross-refer to the head-down displays, which are down in the cockpit. The head-up display is so important because with fast jet operations, the most important thing for you is to look out. If you have no radar, the only way of detecting any conflict, be it the ground or another aircraft, is the Mark 1 eyeball. So lookout is paramount to your survival. So the head-up display was a device which was designed to keep the pilot's head up, hence the name, clues in the title, and keep you looking out of the aircraft at all times, and particularly to present to you a weapon aiming target information system, which I'll come on to in a second. So there was the instrument phase where you learn how to fly the aircraft on instruments, the head-up display primarily, and backed up with the head-down instruments. And then into your formation training. That's right, you learn how to fly the aircraft in formation. And then you got into the navigation phase, learning how to use the information presented to you with the head-up display, interact with the projected map display, and interact with the HSI. The HSI is the horizontal situation indicator. All aircraft have them. But the Jaguar was designed to present some of the information that would be assisting you with navigation on the HSI as well. The system that was in use at the time was a thing called NavWAS, which is Navigation and Weapon Aiming Subsystem. Very basic by modern standards. There are about 1 million times the power in a standard SD card of a camera than there was in the computer of the aircraft of the day. But the interact with the NavWAS, and it was the idea was to try and ease your workload, as I'm sure you appreciate, is a very busy environment. So you learn low-level navigation, how to use low-level flying the aircraft at low level, how to utilise the way the information is presented to you, how the displays work, how to use the PMD, the projected or pilot's map display, and the HSI. Then you went into low-level navigation. It's bread and butter. The Jaguar was designed to fly at low level and attack targets from low level. There was no other way of doing it really at that stage, at that time. All the weaponry all the ordnance was based on that philosophy. So from there you then get into the weapons phase. You start learning how to drop the various weapons that the aircraft carried using the symbology which the head-up display would present to you in order to carry out air-to-ground attacks, using 1,000-pound retard bombs, 1,000-pound freefall bombs, and using the cannons. You had 2 Aiden cannons in the aircraft as well. There were also some manoeuvres you would fly where you would deliver a weapon, a freefall bomb, throwing it or lofting it as it was called. There was two procedures. There was tossing a bomb and lofting a bomb. One was using the kit and one was a reversionary procedure. So you would toss or loft the bombs on the range, and the whole of the system was designed to introduce you to how the symbology interacted with the control of the kit on the aircraft and the use of the various weapons. From there you went on to what was known as the SAP phase, which is the simulated attack profiles, learning how to utilise the aircraft. Now it's all coming together, how you use the symbology, how you use the weaponry, using range details, all the rest of it. From the SAP phase you then moved into the TM phase, tactical manoeuvring as I recall, where you learn how to handle the aircraft. And this is the interesting bit, because the aircraft, of its limitations, you have to be very conscious at all times of what you're doing with it, particularly when you're operating it on the limit. And because the Jaguar at low level was often being operated on the limit, particularly if you were under possible threat, you had to be aware at all times of what you were doing with it. The new concept at the time was angle of attack. Every aircraft I'd flown up to the point where we went to the Jaguar was flown in relation to airspeed and performance. You now had this new concept of angle of attack, and everything that was presented to you was in relation to angle of attack, which is the way the airflow interacts with the wing surface. Following the TM phase, it was then the OP phase, which was the final phase of the course really, where everything came together and you did what you would be doing primarily when you got to the squadrons, albeit it would be taken to the next level when you got there. You have to understand that when you go through training, every phase of training is a new start, and you're embarking on a new course of training, and it can all go wrong at any stage. And as I've always said to everybody that has spoken to me about flying is a learning exercise. It always is. You never know everything. It's always a learning experience. Every lesson, be it 8,501 as the case may be for me, is a learning experience. You never know everything, so you have to treat it in that way.
Yeah.